Fabrica! Welcome to our Taíno Culture series. I'm Priscilla Colon, co-founder and creative here at Casabe, where our mission is to promote the Taíno language and culture. So today, I have a compilation of our best of videos focusing on Taíno foods that changed the world. Now, many of these food items may not have originated on our Caribbean islands. They were the result of thousands upon thousands of years of indigenous innovation. However, because we were the first culture and language of contact with Europeans, many of these foods that came from our islands were then spread around the world, their names along with them. So let's dive a little bit more deeply into the backgrounds of these foods, their origins, and then how they became part of the rest of the world. But let's start first with some basic information about our Taíno ancestors. Fun fact, it was written by the chroniclers that our Taíno ancestors ate between 3 and 4 meals a day. But of course, during an areito, a ceremonial dance or celebration, there would be a giant feast that would last for several days. And during those feasts, they would eat way late into the night. You need to recover your calories after a lot of dancing, right? Cows were not on the American continent, so our indigenous ancestors didn't drink cow's milk. And actually, studies show that between 65 and 70% of all humans are lactose intolerant. That means that they can't process milk. It's even higher in Asian and indigenous populations. So, if you are of Taíno descent, it is very likely that you are lactose intolerant too. In this case, milk does not do the body good. If you saw Disney's Encanto, you're already familiar with the arepa. A while ago, you learned that arepa is a type of corn cake. It is a traditional indigenous food that is still eaten today. Just a few weeks ago, I had a delicious arepa at a local Puerto Rican tapas place. The bread that our Taíno ancestors used to eat is casabe, and that is a special bread made out of yuca. Yuca, also known as manioc or cassava, was the main crop of our Taíno ancestors. To prepare the yuca, you would first have to dig it up from underground. Yuca is a tuber. It grows underground like a potato, sweet potato, and other root vegetables. To prepare the yuca, you first have to grate it. Then you have to squeeze the toxic juices out of it with something called a sibukan, that is the yuca squeezer. Then they would grind up the yuca into the flour, which makes casabe, the yuca bread. When the Europeans first came to the Caribbean, it was the first time that they had encountered a pineapple. In Taíno, the word is ananas, and this word may have actually come from the Guarani word nana. The Guarani language is part of the Tupian or Tupi languages family, and you see the Tupian languages occupy the pink area of this map. You'll notice that the Arawak languages occupy the blue area. Our people probably came in contact with each other, so whether the word for pineapple, ananas, came from the Arawak and then traveled to the Guarani, or whether it came from the Guarani and then traveled to the Arawak, we don't really know. But we know that there probably was contact between our people, which meant cultural exchange. And actually, in most of Europe, the word for pineapple is ananas. When the Europeans came, it was the first time that they had ever had food that had been cooked on a platform over fire. Barbacoa referred to this process of cooking. And in English, it came to mean a lot of different things, from the grill, the event, and even the sauce that you put on some meats. The platform on which our Taíno ancestors cooked meats was called bucan. It was a wooden platform. You could call it the OG of grills. Well, this word actually was borrowed and then a new word was created. So did you know that the word Buccaneer actually comes from the word Bucan. Soon after the Europeans arrived to the Caribbean, they began fighting amongst each other for land, gold, all kinds of stuff. So the French pirates used to attack the Spanish and then flee into the woods or the mountains, where they learned how to use the bucan. The Spanish started calling the French pirates bucaneros, which is like people who use the bucan. And by the way, who did the Buccaneers learn how to use the bucan from? Our Taíno ancestors, who taught them how to survive in the woods and in the mountains using the barbacoa process. I don't know about you, but I love chocolate. And chocolate has such an interesting history. So the original word for chocolate comes from the Nahuatl word that is the language spoken by the Aztec or Mexica people of Mesoamerica. And the word chocoatl means bitter water. From the Nahuatl, it came into the Spanish and it was transformed into chocolate. And from there is where we get the Taíno chocolate. Archaeologists can trace chocolate all the way back to the Olmec Empire, which occupied the area you see on the screen. The Maya also used chocolate, and they occupied a very similar area. The Maya revered chocolate. It was used in celebrations, and they used to mix it with chili peppers and make a drink from it. The Aztec or Mexica people also used chocolate. And as you can see, they occupied this area. They also used to drink it hot or cold and mixed with a lot of chilies and other things. And it was also the Mexica currency. It was thought to be more valuable than gold. Now, did our Taíno ancestors have chocolate? Yes, they did. Christopher Columbus did come across chocolate and even took some back on his voyages to Spain. And so we can assume that chocolate got to the Caribbean before the Spanish were there. And it makes sense because the Maya coast is so close to our Taíno ancestors' homelands. Now a staple food all around the world, potatoes were first domesticated by indigenous peoples of southern Peru about 10,000 years ago. And it makes sense that Peru alone would have more than 3,800 types or varieties of potatoes. Our Taíno ancestors grew potatoes as well. Because potatoes need loose soil so that water drains, they would create large mounds of dirt and then put the potatoes inside. That way they could grow freely. We started growing them a few years ago in a raised bed. And it is so cool how easily you can get a bunch of potatoes. So how did Taínos contribute to the spread of potatoes around the world? Well, they introduced Europeans to potatoes. And even the word potato comes from the Taíno word batata or patata, which is a very specific sweet potato. So, to honor our Taíno ancestors and continue their agricultural traditions, you can plant your own potatoes. The Three Sisters are a staple of Indigenous America. But where did these crops actually come from? Well, most archaeologists can trace these crops back to Mesoamerica. That is the part that we know now as Mexico and a lot of the countries in Central America. From there, these crops moved up toward North America and down toward South America. They were shared with indigenous groups in these areas who also took them and created their own varieties. Corn has such an interesting history. Scientists don't really know how humans created it, but the Indigenous Americans were the first to create this. It could even be that corn was the first genetically modified species by humans. It was domesticated somewhere in the Tehuacan Valley around 9,000 or more years ago. and it quickly became a feature in many indigenous gardens. The word milpa in Spanish, which now refers to a sort of Mexican garden, actually comes from the word milli in Nahuatl, which means garden. In Taíno, the word conuco or cunucu is what was traditionally used. But whether in a milpa or conuco, the same sisters were grown together. Sometimes a fourth or fifth sister was added, such as chiles or hot peppers. Now, this type of gardening was not what Europeans were used to seeing. They were used to seeing neat rows of the same plant over and over again. So when they came to the Americas, they thought the indigenous people didn't know how to plant. They thought that these types of gardens were messy and just wild. But the fact is that this type of gardening is actually the best way to grow plants. The plants help each other grow bigger and better, and you get more fruits and veggies. So what happens when you plant these three sisters together? Let's begin with maize or mahisi, as it is known in Taíno. That's where we get the word for maize or corn. The maize or corn grows first. It has a very thin seed coat full of starch. When the water hits it, it triggers enzymes to turn that starch into sugars. The sugars become a fuel for the embryo inside, and then it starts growing a long, strong stem. What's really interesting is that the leaves that the corn grows don't sit on top of one another, so each one gets sunlight. Next comes pichu, the bean. Its seed swells with water and bursts, and it sends a tiny root down into the ground. But it's not going to grow a stem until the root is really secure. And because it has so much energy inside the seed, including its first leaves, it doesn't need to grow a stem right away. It grows leaves first and then a long vine in a circle, wrapping around the corn, which at this point is already knee-high. The last one to bloom is auyama, pumpkin. It takes weeks for the first stems to poke out of the ground, and its leaves have to break out of the seed. The pumpkin or squash extends herself along the ground, away from the others. It has wide umbrella-like leaves. So why should you grow these three sisters together? Well, they have a sense of reciprocity, a give and a take. So the first one, corn, does a very obvious job. It supports the beans as they grow. The beans have an interesting job. They actually invite bacteria into their roots. This bacteria turns the nitrogen gas in the air into the nitrogen that the plants need in the soil. So really, the beans are feeding all three sisters. The pumpkin's job comes from one of its biggest features, its leaves. The big leaves help keep the soil moist so that it retains water. And it keeps the weeds from growing because it provides shade. In addition, the little hairy parts of its leaves and vines stop caterpillars, deer, raccoons, and other animals that might otherwise eat all the veggies. The ají is another word that comes from Taíno, and it was incorporated into the Spanish language. Ají can be sweet or they can be hot, and sometimes people use the word ají to mean hot peppers. Now, the ají was used not only to season foods, but it was actually used in what could possibly be the first recorded instance of chemical warfare. So it was written by the Spanish chroniclers that Taínos use a sort of capsaicin bomb, a kind of smoke bomb made out of ají. What would happen is they would take a pumpkin or calabash, hollow it out, put burning ashes and crushed ají inside. Then they would take it, throw it at the enemy, and the enemy would obviously be like choking on the gas and they couldn't see, it would get all in their eyes. And that's when the Taínos would come in, covered up, so they were protected from the smoke, and then they would beat them over the head with macanas and hopefully kill them off. So don't believe the stories that our Taíno ancestors were just so nice and so docile that they never even defended themselves. That's absolutely not true. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video on all of the amazing contributions that our Taíno language and culture made to the foods that we eat today, that are eaten by almost everyone around the world. We should all be thankful to our indigenous ancestors for developing such amazing foods. What would life be without barbecue, potato, chocolate, and so much more? Want to teach the kiddos about Taíno foods? Check out our kids' books, especially A Twisty Vine, where we learn more Taíno words for fruits and vegetables. This is how we're going to get the new generations to learn Taíno too. To continue the conversation, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. In the meantime, Taikara ya Guaitiao Nagu.